This presentation is on the world trade system to 1500. So we're talking about the Afro-Eurasian trade system, which is a part of the African continent, which is right here, and the Eurasian continent, which includes Europe and everything that's connected east-west in the continent of Europe and Asia. The Afro-Eurasian trade system was a world economy in the period before 1500, which was centered on the Indian Ocean. All right, the Indian Ocean being this large body of water here and the bodies connected to it. Europe, which is up here, was not a dominant trading partner. Wealthy Europeans did want to purchase Asian goods, and so they wanted access to the world economy, but they were not a direct part of it. The Indian Ocean was the dominant player in the Afro-Eurasian trade system in the 14th and 15th centuries. And you can see here it included commercial exchanges between China and India along these trade routes right here that start here and end up in this area. And then India and the Middle East here. That's India and Africa, India and the Middle East. Africa, and of course from the Middle East to Africa as well, all the way out down to Mombasa, all the way up to Alexandria and Cairo, and then eventually trade routes to Europe as well. The Indian Ocean included merchant cities that were concentrated around the ocean's edges, not just in India, but as you can see here in Africa, in Arabia, in the Middle East, along the Indian coast, and of course in Southeast Asia as well. Most of these city-states were self-governing cities, and because of the fact that they were self-governing and their livelihoods depended on trade, they were all interested in preserving themselves and their wealth. And so they limited the use of violence when trading, and they also limited trade monopolies, and instead relied on fair trade with each other. This is a set of pictures of Malacca in the 15th century. And you can see that canals were built to carry ships, that there's a heavy Chinese influence, and that Malacca includes this strait here where Singapore is today, which kind of constricts trade. It makes it a perfect place to build a port because almost all traders will be coming through there. One of the most important parts of the Indian Ocean trade was the China trade. This started with Mongol emperors trading with the West. They traded with Europe overland. Eventually, as you can see in this map here, this is a two-way route, the Silk Roads, which go west and east, eventually to the west. And we also see after 1368, changes in Chinese trade. The Ming Dynasty looked inward to Chinese culture and agriculture and limited trade with the outside world. It limited use of the Silk Road and also limited its access to the Indian Ocean for purposes of containing China and rebuilding Chinese strength. However, as Chinese population grew, and its commercial growth and urbanization increased, China also began to once again trade with the rest of the world. It was the most advanced economy in the world up to 1700, and in the 15th century, the Chinese developed these huge treasure ships, some of them more than 700 feet long, which carried tremendous amounts of goods and people throughout the Indian Ocean on diplomatic missions. Those voyages are known as the 7 Great Voyages of Zheng He. Zheng He's voyages occurred over the years from 1405 to 1433, and they had a diplomatic purpose rather than a trading purpose. What you can see in this picture is an artist's rendering of one of the giant diplomatic fleets that Zheng He commanded. In the center are 4 great treasure ships, and then other ships of varying sizes. There were also Japanese and Taiwanese vessels and Korean vessels that tagged along on the outsides of the fleets. These fleets had official sizes of up to 65 Chinese vessels, but sometimes hundreds of vessels in all, including all of the hangers-on, private traders, etc. However, eventually the cost and the fact that these voyages, although they were diplomatic, appeared to be for trade purposes, led China's government to end them in 1433. It helps to understand Zheng He to prevent us from assuming that voyages of conquest, such as those of Columbus, are the norm. In fact, Zheng He is only known to have conquered one place. That was what is today Sri Lanka, and the reason for that is that he apparently felt that the king of Sri Lanka wasn't respecting the Chinese emperor enough, and so he used his soldiers to replace that king on the throne. Not an easy thing to excuse. On the other hand, he also called back his soldiers and did not occupy or colonize Sri Lanka at all. So the idea of claiming territory for China was not a part of these missions. They were, as I said, diplomatic, mostly interested in gaining tribute and acceptance of other kingdoms, of the idea that China was the most advanced state in the world, but they were not colonizing activities. And if we ask ourselves why didn't they colonize, we are of course assuming that Columbus's style of colonization was the norm. Neither one is necessarily the norm here. But 1433 certainly marked a turning point in world history. And by 1600, Chinese immigrants to Southeast Asia, such as Luzon, controlled large portions of Asian trade economy. Why did they do that? Primarily because the Chinese government had officially ended trade, and so Chinese families who had been a part of that trade moved either part or all of their operations overseas in order to continue trading with the trade contacts they had made in the Indian Ocean. This is one of the reasons why there are so many Chinese cities and parts of cities throughout Southeast Asia. India provided the link between the Persian Gulf and China. Arab merchants eventually returned to India after long periods of absence, and they revived the coastal Indian port cities on their way to trade in the South China Sea. They eventually established trading posts at places like Goa, Calicut, and Kilbo, which were Indian trading cities, and Indian trade in textiles and spices prospered because of that reconnection. In fact, India's Coromandel coast became one of the key centers for trade with Southeast Asia. And as a part of that trade, India itself was an important contributor of goods. India contributed pepper. It contributed India cotton cloth and silk cloth. India was, in fact, the largest supplier of textiles and of pepper in the world in the 14th and 15th centuries. And if you're curious about why I mentioned pepper, it's important to recognize that in this period, 1 ounce of pepper was worth 1 ounce of gold. So pepper was a very valuable substance, and that was found in India, as well as Indian cotton cloth, which was where you got most of the cotton cloth in the world. In fact, English and French and Germans all wore cotton cloth from India, and Indian patterns were the norm throughout the world. Indian Ocean also provided cultural links to India. There is a great cultural diversity in India and in Southeast Asia, but many of these places share sociocultural similarities as well. So in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, for example, all speak or spoke variants of the Austronesian language. They also shared a common environment, which led to common diet, which focused on rice, fish, palms, and palm wine. All of them also shared a sparse population, which was concentrated mostly in the rice-growing areas and port cities of Southeast Asia and India. And these areas also shared a generally high status of women culturally. Women were in most ways the equal of men, and in some areas considered superior to men. Women were frequently looked upon as superior at conducting business, and men in fact went to great lengths to please women in order to marry successful women who were business people, politicians, and legal experts, all kinds of different things. But Africa was also a part of the 15th century world trade system. You can see here some of the city-states that participated in the African trade with the Indian Ocean trade, and most of these are in the area of what we call the Swahili coast. As I said, each one of them was independent from the others. They are not, or were not, part of the states that are listed on this map as modern states today. So we have Kilwa, Ibo Island, which is pictured right here. So this is the old town in Ibo, and still a very important place, and part of the importance from trade in the 14th and 15th centuries. We also have the Comoros Islands here. We have Zanzibar, and we also have Brava, Chismayu, Mombasa, some of them very important cities even today. And this is the connections between Europe and Africa. Most of these connections went northward into Europe. In fact, you can see here that Cairo traded up into Turkey and also to the Aegean and also to Italy. Ports in northern Africa traded up into Sicily and Italy, that the Europeans found connections to all sorts of goods in Africa. Africa actually included some important commodities itself. One of the most important was gold, also betel nuts, salt, a whole host of other things. And Africa also was the connection between Europe and the Indian Ocean trade. So pepper, spices, textiles, goods from China and Southeast Asia, all came to Europe from Africa. Inland Africa, which you see here, provided the way stations, etc., for the trade. So much of the gold that was found in Africa, for example, was found in this region right here in the part of south of the Sahara Desert. And Cairo provided a connection between the Indian Ocean trade and Africa. And these areas in between, these all were way stations where traders went through, and it was their policies and their willingness to provide trade and act as middlemen that increased or decreased prices. So they became a very important part of the trade networks as well. And we haven't really spent much time on the Middle East yet, but the Middle East was a key part of the trade as well. What you see here on the far right, this is the Ottoman Empire, which was in existence from the 14th century all the way through 1918. And this is a Chinese style bowl that was manufactured in the Ottoman Empire. So you can see the influence of China on Ottoman crafts. And then here we have the city or town of Safranbolu, which was the source of saffron in Turkey. And saffron, of course, a very important spice in Southern European cooking as well as Middle Eastern cooking. So the Middle East was both the intermediary for trade between Europe and Africa and Asia, and also a block to direct access. The Ottoman and Safavid empires prevented Europeans from trading directly with China. This is not because Europeans were not allowed to travel across them, but because of their existence, the trade went through them because they had traders and ports that were closer to the Indian Ocean than Europeans did. And in order then to trade with the Indian Ocean, Europeans had to either go through these areas themselves or more frequently buy from traders that came from these areas. It's for this reason that Columbus and da Gama eventually went looking for an alternate route to the Indian Ocean and to China. And Europe's entry points were Genoa and Venice. Europe was only a minor player on the very western edge of the Afro-Eurasian trading system, and Europeans wanted luxury goods. These goods arrived, as I said, from the Middle East via Genoa, which is right here, and Venice, which is right here. And because of their status as ports, these two competed for goods. Eventually, the Genoese and the Venetians split the trade in half. So the Venetians took control of trade on the western half of the Mediterranean, thus dealing with trade that came from the Middle East and from the Indian Ocean trading system, whereas the Genoese tended to trade in the western half of the Mediterranean, as you can see here, and their trade was primarily in African goods, particularly West African goods, in sugar from the Mediterranean islands and from the Canary Islands, which are off the coast of Africa, sort of roughly over here, and also slaves into Europe. So that concludes our discussion of the European position in the world trading system in the 14th and 15th centuries.